ready to dig into some serious military strategy. Because today, we're building some pretty impressive fortifications.
Oh, sounds defensive. Are we hunkering down for this deep dive?
Well, we're tackling fortresses, so I guess,
Yeah.
in a way, yeah. But we're doing it with Carl von Clausewitz as our guide. We're going deep into his work on war to see how he viewed fortresses.
This should be good. Clausewitz always brings a unique perspective.
Right, he didn't just see these as piles of bricks, but as active pieces in a much larger game.
It's like they become chess pieces on the battlefield, but with much higher stakes, obviously.
Absolutely. And what I find fascinating is how Clausewitz, writing back in the 19th century, understood that the role of fortresses was already changing drastically.
It's easy to picture like a medieval castle, all about keeping the invaders out. But Clausewitz saw how things were different, especially with the development of, well,
Artillery?
exactly. Suddenly, a strong wall wasn't enough. A fortress had to be about more than just solid defenses.
It had to adapt to a whole new era of warfare.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because Clausewitz argues that a well-designed fortress could make an army more mobile, not less, which seems a little counterintuitive at first.
It does. Because you'd think a fortress would tie you down, make you less flexible.
You'd think so. But consider this. A fortress is a secure anchor, a safe place to store all your essential supplies, which gives you a massive advantage in terms of logistics.
Like having a fully stocked supply depot exactly where you need it most.
Precisely. You're not constantly scrambling, trying to keep your troops supplied, but it's not all about defense either. Clausewitz was adamant about the active element of a fortress.
Active element. So he's saying it's not just a passive barrier?
Exactly. He saw it as a springboard for offensive action, a base for flanking maneuvers. Think of it like a boxer using their guard to set up a knockout punch.
So it's less about just hunkering down and more about dictating the pace of the fight.
Absolutely. Controlling the battlefield by forcing the enemy to react to your moves.
That's really interesting. It almost sounds like he's talking about psychological warfare as much as physical defense.
And you wouldn't be wrong. Clausewitz called this indirect influence. Basically, a fortress having a ripple effect on enemy movements far beyond its walls.
Almost like a mind game. Even if they never attack the fortress directly, its presence can completely throw off their plans.
Precisely. Imagine you're trying to invade, and there's this heavily fortified city right at a critical crossroads. You could try to bypass it, sure.
But that would mean a longer, more vulnerable route, right?
Yeah, potentially exposing your supply lines, which is a huge risk.
So even the threat of a fortress can be a powerful deterrent.
Exactly. It's like a strategically placed roadblock, slowing down their advance and giving you, the defender, time to regroup and strategize.
It makes you realize how much thought has to go into choosing the right locations for these fortresses.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something Clausewitz dives into quite a bit. He really emphasizes that it's not just about finding a spot with high walls and calling it good.
There's much more to it than that.
Way more. He uses the example of southern Germany versus France to illustrate this, pointing out that a city like Munich, even though it's not as naturally fortified as some, still holds a lot of strategic weight.
Because of its location, right?
Exactly. It's all about anticipating those invasion routes and how a well-placed fortress can disrupt them. Almost like playing a game of Risk, but with much, much higher stakes.
It's like that old saying, location, location, location. Except in this case, it's not about real estate, but about the fate of nations.
Exactly. And Clausewitz was big on considering natural barriers when planning fortress locations. Rivers, mountains, forests, those geographical features that make an attacker's life way more difficult.
Right. Use the terrain to your advantage.
Mm.
He specifically mentions the importance of a fortress on a river, but he argues that it's actually more strategic to place it slightly inland rather than directly on the bank. Why is that? Wouldn't being right on the river be more defensible?
You'd think so. But Clausewitz realized if it's too close to the riverbank, the enemy might just find another crossing point and bypass it completely.
So it's about controlling a wider area.
Exactly. Positioning it a bit inland forces the enemy to play on your terms. Their movements become more predictable, which makes them easier to counter.
It's fascinating how much strategic thinking goes into every single placement. Now, what about that debate of concentrating fortresses on the borders versus distributing them further inland? There are arguments to be made on both sides, right?
Absolutely. And Clausewitz acknowledges the merits of both. A concentrated line of fortresses on the border. That's a powerful deterrent. It's like saying don't even think about it. But Having fortresses further inland gives you strategic depth.
Like a backup plan if the initial lines are breached.
Precisely. It makes the enemy's advance way more complicated because now they have to contend with these strongholds throughout the territory. They can't just breeze through.
So it's about finding that balance between presenting a strong front line, but also having those fallback points if or when the enemy adapts their strategy.
And that's what Clausewitz stresses again and again, adaptability. No plan survives contact with the enemy. You have to be able to adjust, to exploit weaknesses, to stay one step ahead. And a well-designed system of fortresses allows you to do just that. It gives you options. It allows you to roll with the punches.
He also talks about how a fortress can be more than just a defensive position, especially after a retreat. It can be a place for troops to regroup, to recover, to regain their strength.
It's that idea of a fortress as a symbol of resilience. Imagine you're a soldier, you've been through a grueling retreat, and suddenly you see those familiar walls.
The safety.
Exactly. Yeah. A safe haven to rest, rearm, and prepare for a counteroffensive. It's like a psychological boost as much as a tactical one.
He even hints at how fortresses could play a role in what we might now call unconventional warfare. Resistance movements, guerrilla tactics.
You're picking up what Clausewitz is putting down. He recognized that a fortress could become a thorn in the side of an occupying force, a place to store weapons, to coordinate attacks. It's about making their lives as difficult as possible.
And remember, he was writing in a time when the concept of total war involving entire populations was emerging.
Right, so he was already thinking about how warfare was changing, how civilians would increasingly be drawn into the conflict, and he saw how fortresses could fit into that changing landscape, not just as military strongholds, but as symbols of resistance, of defiance.
Places of refuge, too, potentially.
Yeah.
So even as warfare evolved, Clausewitz saw how fortresses could remain relevant even if their role became more adaptable.
Exactly. But, and this is important, he warns against getting too fixated on fortresses as the be-all and end-all of defense. He cautions against what he calls strategic niceties, basically these elaborate fortifications that might look impressive on a map but fall apart in the chaos of actual battle.
Form over function. He was all about practicality.
100%. Clausewitz brings it back to the human element of war. Yes, fortresses are important, but they're just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It's the courage of the soldiers, the skill of the commanders, the will of the people that ultimately determine victory.
He really hammers that home. No amount of brick and mortar can replace those intangible factors.
It's about having that bigger picture in mind. A fortress can buy you time, give you a tactical advantage, but it's up to the people within those walls to seize the moment.
To turn defense into offense.
Exactly. And that's a theme that runs throughout Clausewitz's work.
It's all connected, isn't it? The physical structures, the strategic thinking, the human element, they all play a part.
They do. It's like a complex machine, and Clausewitz helps us understand how all the gears fit together.
And that's why his work is still so relevant today. He encourages us to see warfare as this dynamic, constantly changing challenge.
He wouldn't want us to just memorize formulas, but really grasp the core principles of strategy.
So we can adapt, improvise, and overcome whatever challenges we face.
Exactly. Whether we're facing down a traditional army or navigating the complexities of modern conflict.
Which often involves those figurative fortresses you mentioned earlier. Cybersecurity, information warfare, economic leverage. These things might not be physical structures.
But they can be just as strategically important as any fortress.
It's about recognizing those points of strength and understanding how they can be leveraged. Clausewitz gives us the tools to do that.
He really does. It's been fascinating unpacking all of this with you.
Likewise.
Ooh.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of strategy, history, and the ever-evolving nature of warfare. Until next time, keep those strategic minds sharp.